In the 8th month of the war between Ukraine and Russia, very critical developments are taking place that can change the fate of the world. After Vladimir Putin's declaration of mobilization in Russia and the decision to annex 4 regions in Ukraine, the whole world focused on the war between Russia and Ukraine. As a result of the legendary progress of the Ukrainian armed forces in the last month and the complete crushing of the Russian army, Russian President Vladimir Putin started to make absurd statements out of his hiding hole. The statements of Putin, who has not broken his silence for a long time, are at a level of insanity, and while the dose of this madness is increasing, he throws himself and his army into a bottomless abyss. Ukraine has now turned into a witch's cauldron for the Russian army. With the offensive carried out by the Ukrainian armed forces over Kharkiv, the Russian army retreated with all its lines. More precisely, the Russian army had to retreat, because the strategy of the Ukrainian heroes was executed flawlessly. In response, Putin declared mobilization in his country to find a solution to the problems of the Russian army. After this mobilization, 300,000 soldiers are planned to be sent to Ukraine. However, these soldiers are soldiers who are sent to the front with very limited training. It is reported that these recruits surrendered en masse immediately after the Russians arrived in Ukraine. And this incident shows us that Putin's strategy has collapsed. The best choice for these recruits seems to be to surrender to the Ukrainian armed forces. Russian recruits were given no choice and no rights. The first units have been on the Ukrainian fronts for 4 to 5 days, and already hundreds of them have surrendered en masse to the Ukrainian armed forces. This may be the only chance for drunk and rookie Russian soldiers to live. They are seen as mere bait in the eyes of their commanders and Putin. On the other hand, when Vladimir Putin thinks that the troops he sent in support of the Russian army in the region are strengthening the Russian army, it is useless. Encountering the heroic Ukrainians, Russian recruits say that they surrender only out of fear. Most Russian recruits say that they were forcibly brought to the region, and they say they are afraid. A spokesperson for Ukrainian military intelligence said that Russian men recruited for the Kremlin's war effort are already trying to avoid the front lines by surrendering themselves to the Ukrainian authorities. Andriy Yusov, spokesman for the Intelligence Directorate of Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, told state television that the Russians who had recently taken action had contacted a hotline set up by Ukrainian security services that wanted to surrender. Yusov's remarks follow other reports of the difficulties faced by Russian President Vladimir Putin's plan to mandate military service in support of his military campaign in Ukraine. After Ukrainian forces successfully recaptured parts of the country in a counteroffensive this month, Putin announced a partial draft in a televised speech last week. The draft applies to Russian citizens in the military reserves or persons with certain military expertise and relative experience in the armed forces. Yusov said Russia has already exhausted existing troops in Donetsk and Luhansk administrative regions, 2 regions under the control of separatists friendly to the Kremlin. Yusov said the Russians are unwilling to fight in Ukraine, and those who have been mobilized or have not yet been called the Ukraine hotline. The UK's Ministry of Defense said in an update on the war on Monday that mobilized soldiers have begun arriving at the bases as Russia faces an administrative and logistical challenge to provide training to its soldiers. The lack of military trainers and Russia's rush to initiate mobilization and the enlisted troops will be deployed to the front with minimal preparation. The Russian military will likely suffer a high attrition rate. Putin can recruit more troops by ordering a partial mobilization, but he will have to do so inefficiently and with high internal social and political costs. For the Russian army, it is clear that the newly recruited forces will not make a significant contribution to Russia's military strength, and Putin will first need to correct the fundamental flaws in the Russian military personnel and equipment systems. But this is not possible for them in the picture, because as a result of Western sanctions, Russia's defense industry is on the verge of collapse, and almost no Russian company can supply enough spare parts. It is unlikely that Putin will overcome key structural challenges as he tries to mobilize large numbers of Russians to continue his war in Ukraine. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov critically told reporters that there were cases of violations of the mobilization decree. At the same time, according to a statement from the British Ministry of Defense, Russian soldiers enlisted to fight in Ukraine as part of Russian President Vladimir Putin's partial mobilization are likely to be sent to the front lines with minimal preparation. The ministry said in its intelligence update that the first groups of soldiers prepared for mobilization have begun to arrive at military bases, and Russia now faces an administrative and logistical challenge to provide training to the troops. Unlike most Western armies, the Russian army provides low-level initial training to soldiers in designated operational units, not in specialized training institutions. Typically, one battalion from each Russian brigade remains in the garrison if the other two are deployed and can provide a staff of instructors to train new recruits or reinforcements. However, Russia has deployed most of these 3rd battalions to Ukraine. The lack of military trainers and Russia's rush to initiate mobilization indicate that many of the enlisted troops will be deployed to the front with minimal preparation. They will likely suffer a high rate of attrition. Putin's partial draft announced last week applies to Russian citizens and reservists and those serving in the military with certain military expertise and relevant experience. As Ukraine's counterattacks resulted in various setbacks for Putin's army, the order was expected to call in 300,000 soldiers to fight for Russia. There are already signs that the mobilization process for Russia is not going smoothly. Videos are circulating on social media showing drunk Russian men believed to be novices traveling to Ukraine. Anton Gerashenko, advisor to the Minister of Internal Affairs of Ukraine, released a video showing the Russians saying that they were tasked with firearms that seemed to rust with age. It is thought that Russian President Vladimir Putin is struggling to fulfill the mandate he set and will likely fail to produce low-quality mobilized reserves. If the Kremlin could not quickly resolve fundamental and systemic problems, Putin's plans would come to light. Reported problems with the implementation of the Russian draft were accompanied by a strong return to the mobilization order within the country. He estimates that 2,386 people were arrested in protests against mobilization in Russia between September 21st and 26th. It is also stated that these arrests are increasing day by day. In connection with the creation of a siege threat, Allied troops have withdrawn from the city to a more advantageous location, the Russian ministry said in a statement on the messaging app, following the recent sieges. The latest raids by the Ukrainian armed forces made this siege even more difficult for Putin. The setback for Russia came less than 24 hours after Mr. Putin's most heartbreaking speech of the war on Friday, describing the U.S. as Satanism and the West as hostile, deceptive, and hypocritical. Putin is trying to save himself from this impasse. However, his moves in this situation are seen as a desperate struggle. Vladimir Putin should pull himself together or give up. Otherwise, he will lose his throne